it was alive. I still remember that first morning at Bovell Training Camp, 1914. We were told the area was clear of enemy forces, but the mist, it had eyes. Hauptmann Mueller stood before our Special Forces unit, his voice cutting through the morning silence like a blade through wet canvas. "You are Stormtrooper now," he said, the German rolling off his tongue like a prayer. "Elite infiltrators. When regular infantry fails, you slip through enemy lines like ghosts." The irony wasn't lost on me then. Ghosts. We learned to move without sound, to kill without mercy. But during night training exercises, something watched us back. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision during combat drills, shadows that shouldn't exist, whispers in the static of our field radios. "Schmidt," Gefreiter Hans would say, pointing into the darkness beyond our perimeter. "You see that?" I always saw it. The unnatural presence that followed our recon missions. A figure, human-shaped, but wrong somehow, standing just outside the reach of our oil lamps. When you looked directly, nothing. When you looked away, there. The other soldiers felt it too. The way conversations died mid-sentence. How our compasses spun wildly near the old cemetery outside camp. The voices in our heads that whispered coordinates we'd never received from HQ. Hauptmann Mueller dismissed it as war trauma setting in early. "Fear makes men see demons," he'd say. But we weren't afraid yet. That came later. The morning we graduated to active combat zone deployment, I found muddy footprints outside my tent. Human prints, but walking backward, away from camp. Into the mist that never lifted, no matter how bright the sun burned.
"Permission to enter the kill zone, sir."
Those words became our mantra during the final weeks of preparation. But something else answered back through the radio silence. Something that wasn't our commanding officer. The advanced training pushed us past exhaustion into hallucination territory. Or so we told ourselves. 72 hours without sleep, moving through mock trenches filled with smoke and the smell of cordite. That's when the paranormal encounters began in earnest. I thought I was losing my mind the first time I heard it. A child's laughter echoing from inside an empty ammunition crate. Mueller heard it too. His face went white as winter frost. Requesting immediate sitrep on civilian presence in training area. He radioed to HQ. Static. Then, "No civilians reported in your grid reference, Hauptmann." But we all heard her. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, singing a lullaby in French. The melody drifted through our combat zone like fog through barbed wire. When we investigated, we found small handprints pressed into the mud, too small for any adult, too perfect for any child who should have been there. The psychological pressure was intentional, they said. Break us down, build us back up as perfect killing machines. But you can't train a man to ignore supernatural forces that defy explanation. During our final night exercise, extraction point coordinates kept changing on our maps. Grid references we'd memorized became meaningless as paths shifted in the darkness. The enemy territory we'd studied for weeks had become something else entirely. "Sir, the compass isn't working," reported Obergefreiter Klaas. None of our equipment worked properly anymore. As if the land itself rejected our presence. February 1916. Verdun was supposed to be our proving ground. They told us the area was clear of supernatural activity. They lied. Our Special Forces unit infiltrated the French trenches under cover of pre-dawn darkness. Standard recon mission. gather intelligence, eliminate sentries, prepare for the main assault. But the whispers started before we even reached enemy territory. "Do you copy?" came through the radio static, but in a voice I didn't recognize, French accent, speaking perfect German. "There's something in the trees. Over." I checked with my unit. No one had transmitted. The fog that morning was different, thicker, more purposeful. It moved against the wind, pooling in shell craters like spilled milk. Through my field glasses, I watched French soldiers patrol their trenches, but their movements were wrong, mechanical, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. That's when I saw her for the first time. A ghost child, standing in no man's land between the opposing forces. She couldn't have been more than 10, wearing a tattered white dress that hadn't been touched by mud or blood. She looked directly at me through the fog and smiled. "Target acquired," whispered Klaus beside me, raising his rifle. "Negative," I hissed. "Civilian." But when he lowered his weapon, she was gone, just vanished into the mist like she'd never existed. The only proof of the paranormal encounter was the sound, a music box melody playing somewhere in the distance, tinny and broken. The guilt followed us home from that mission. We completed our objectives, but something fundamental had changed. The war wasn't just between nations anymore. It was between the living and whatever lived in the spaces between bullets. The trenches had a memory of their own. 3 weeks after Verdun, we returned to familiar ground for another infiltration, but the landscape had rearranged itself like a puzzle solved by madness. Coordinates sent from HQ led us in circles. Map references that should have taken us east somehow pointed north. "This isn't right," muttered Gefreiter Weber, consulting his compass for the dozenth time. "They've passed this crater before." I knew he was correct, but admitting it meant accepting that something beyond enemy artillery was working against us. The hallucination or reality question plagued every step. How do you report to command that the Earth itself had become hostile? Radio silence stretched between us and headquarters. When we finally raised them on the emergency frequency, the voice that responded wasn't human. "Special Forces unit requesting extraction point confirmation," I transmitted. "Extraction denied," came the reply in perfect military protocol. But underneath the words, I heard breathing that didn't match human rhythm. Too slow, too deep. The evil entity, whatever controlled this cursed land, was learning to mimic our procedures. Weber disappeared during our second night in position. Not killed, not captured, simply gone, as if the trench walls had swallowed him whole. We found his rifle propped against a sandbagged corner, still warm. His dog tags hung from the bayonet, swaying in wind that didn't exist underground. But it was the footprints that shattered our remaining sanity. Weber's boots, pressed deep into the mud, led directly into a solid earthen wall. On the other side, we could hear him calling for help. The wall was 3 feet thick, solid clay and stone. Yet somehow he was on the other side, screaming. I shot at something that wasn't there. The muzzle flash illuminated empty air, but I swear on my mother's grave that glowing eyes had been staring back at me through the darkness. Eyes that reflected light like an animal's, but positioned at human height, watching us with intelligence that felt ancient and hungry. "Contact front!" I'd shouted, finger already squeezing the trigger, but Mueller's hands slammed down at my rifle barrel. "Stand down! Visual confirmation only!" That's when we all saw them. Dozens of unnatural presences moving through no man's land, visible only in our peripheral vision. The moment you look directly, they vanished. Look away, and shadows danced just outside your field of view. The jungle went silent around us, if you could call this bombed wasteland a jungle. No rats scurrying through the trenches, no insects buzzing in the stagnant water. Even the artillery had stopped firing, leaving us in a bubble of impossible quiet. "Sir," Klaus, his voice barely audible above his own breathing. "Permission to request immediate evac." But our radios had gone dead. Not static, true silence. as if the electromagnetic spectrum itself had been switched off. We were alone in enemy territory, with whatever supernatural force had claimed this ground as its own. The possession began that night. Weber's voice started echoing through the trench system, calling our names one by one, but Weber was gone, had been gone for days. Yet there he was, somewhere in the labyrinth of mud and wire, singing the same lullaby we'd heard during training. The voices in my head started as whispers, then grew stronger. Coordinates that led nowhere. Orders from officers who died months earlier. Conversations with family members who couldn't possibly know where I was. War trauma, I told myself. But trauma doesn't leave footprints. There were no birds that morning. No sound at all except the screaming. It started at 3 a.m., echoing from every direction at once. Not human voices, something between a child's cry and metal scraping against stone. The kind of sound that makes your teeth ache and your vision blur at the edges. HQ, do you copy? I transmitted on every frequency we had. Requesting immediate extraction. We're not alone out here. The response came in Weber's voice. Extraction denied. Mission parameters unchanged. Hold position until further notice. But Weber was dead. Had been dead for a week. Mueller cracked first. Started talking to empty air. Having full conversations with soldiers who'd never existed, giving orders to a platoon of ghosts, coordinating flanking maneuvers against an enemy that lived between heartbeats. Sir, Klaus tried to interrupt during one of these episodes. Sir, there's no one there. Mueller's eyes focused for a moment, lucid and terrified. That's the problem, soldier. There's no one anywhere. The haunted village nearby had been abandoned since the first artillery barrage, but lights flickered in windows every night. Not electric, oil lamps, moving from room to room in patterns that suggested occupancy. We'd investigated once, finding empty houses filled with the smell of cooking food and recent conversation. On tables set for families that had evacuated months ago. Symbols carved into trees began appearing throughout our sector. Not German, not French. Something older. Lines and circles that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than human eyes could process. The guilt was eating us alive. We'd come here to be hunters. Instead, we'd become prey. I emptied 3 clips into something that laughed at bullets. The figure stood at the far end of the trench, human-shaped, but wrong in ways that made my eyes water. When I fired, the rounds passed through it like mist, striking the earthen wall behind with solid thuds. But the entity kept advancing, each step leaving burned impressions in the mud.
Contact! Contact!
Klaus screamed into his radio, but only received his own voice echoing back seconds later. The paranormal encounter had isolated us from any hope of backup. We'd been trained for combat zone situations, but not for this. How do you fight an enemy that exists between reality and nightmare? Standard military protocol becomes meaningless when your target phases in and out of existence at will. The supernatural force seemed to feed on our fear, growing more solid as our panic increased. I watched it reach out with arms that stretched impossibly long, fingers brushing against my cheek with the cold touch of winter soil. He heard his name at night, it whispered in Weber's voice. Every soldier hears his name eventually. That's when I understood. This wasn't just one evil entity. It was all of them. Every man who died in these trenches, German and French alike, bound together by violence and transformed into something that hungered for living warmth. Muller drew his sidearm and fired point blank into his own temple. The sound echoed through the trench system like thunder, but when we looked, his body was gone. Only his uniform remained, pressed flat against the ground as if he'd simply evaporated from inside his clothes. His voice joined the chorus. Permission to enter the kill zone, sir. The voices came through our equipment now. Every radio transmission carried whispers underneath the official communication. Coordinates that led to mass graves. Orders from command staff who died in previous offensives. Battle plans dictated by generals who'd never existed. Special Forces Unit, report status. Crackled through the speaker in Mueller's voice. Impossible, since we'd watched him die. Klaus answered before I could stop him.
Position secure, sir. Awaiting further orders.
The laughter that came back wasn't human. Multiple voices, layering over each other like a choir of the damned. Through the static, I could hear Weber singing that French lullaby again, joined now by Mueller's baritone and dozens of others. Our weapons had become conduits for the supernatural presence. When I chambered around, I heard my father's voice telling me to come home. When Klaus cleaned his rifle, children's laughter echoed from inside the barrel. Hallucination or reality? I asked myself aloud. Both, came the answer from inside my own head, spoken in my mother's voice. The cursed land was claiming us piece by piece. Not our bodies, our identities. I'd catch myself responding to names that weren't mine, remembering battles I'd never fought, mourning comrades from different wars entirely. The possession was subtle at first, a thought that didn't belong to you, a memory of a childhood home you'd never seen, then stronger, speaking words in languages you didn't know, writing letters to families that had died decades before you were born. Klaus started carving symbols into his rifle stock, the same marks we'd found on the trees. When I asked him about it, he looked down at his hands in confusion.
I thought I was losing my mind,
he whispered. He was. We all were.
They marched in perfect formation behind us.
Through the reflection in my bayonet, I counted them. 37 soldiers in German uniforms, keeping precise distance and interval. When I turned to look directly, empty trench. When I looked back at the blade surface, there they were, an entire platoon of the dead, maintaining military protocol even in death. Sir, do you see them? Klaus whispered, staring at his own weapon's polished surface. I nodded. We both watched our shadow selves performing the same movements we made, but delayed by several seconds. Ghostly mirrors that predicted our actions instead of reflecting them. The unnatural presence had learned to organize itself. What started as individual haunting encounters had evolved into something approaching military tactics. The dead were forming units, establishing command structures, coordinating their supernatural assault on our sanity. Radio chatter filled with voices reporting from grid references that didn't exist on any map. Requesting ammunition for weapons that had been destroyed years ago, calling in artillery strikes on positions occupied by both armies simultaneously. All units, this is Wagner, came through clearly on the emergency frequency. Enemy forces approaching from 6 directions. Prepare for full engagement. Wagner had been our original unit commander. He'd died at Somme 8 months earlier. But his orders were being followed by soldiers throughout the sector, living men responding to commands from the dead, creating chaos that served no tactical purpose except to spread the madness further. The footprints we'd been following for weeks suddenly made sense. They weren't tracking us. They were teaching us to march in formation with an army that existed between life and death, preparing us for service in a war that would never end.
Verdun looked exactly the same as when we'd left it. Too exactly the same. Shell craters in identical positions, barbed wire coiled in patterns that matched my memories perfectly. Even the corpses hadn't decomposed. French and German bodies lying where they'd fallen months earlier, preserved by whatever supernatural force controlled this ground.
This part wasn't in the mission briefing, Klaus muttered, consulting maps that kept changing when he wasn't looking directly at them. Our extraction point coordinates led us in a perfect circle, bringing us back to the same trench system we'd infiltrated during our first combat deployment. But the timeline was wrong. According to our orders, we'd been in the field for 3 days. According to the radio transmissions from HQ, it had been 3 months. I found my own footprints from our previous mission, pressed deep into mud that should have been washed away by spring rains. My boot prints led to a crater where I remembered taking cover from artillery, but in the center of that crater sat a music box, playing the same French lullaby that haunted our dreams. The ghost child was waiting for us. She sat on the rim of a shell hole, swinging her legs like any normal little girl, but her dress was clean white in a landscape painted brown with blood and mud. When she looked at me, I saw my own death reflected in her eyes. "You came back," she said in perfect German, though her lips never moved. The voices in my head screamed in harmony. "Permission to enter the kill zone, sir?" But we were already inside the kill zone, had been inside it since that first training exercise. The war trauma wasn't something that happened to us, it was something we'd brought with us, something we'd become.
October 1917. The Italian front brought new horrors.
Our Special Forces unit had been reassigned to support the Austro-German offensive at Caporetto, but the mountain terrain carried echoes of different battles. Voices speaking Italian mixed with German and French, creating a polyglot chorus of the dead that transcended nationality.
"Requesting evac. There's something in the trees,"
I transmitted, watching shadows move independently of their sources through the alpine forest. The response came in Weber's voice, though Weber had been gone for over a year.
"Evac denied. New orders incoming."
The Italian soldiers we encountered weren't entirely alive. They moved with the same mechanical precision we'd observed in the French trenches, fighting battles that had ended weeks earlier, responding to commands from officers who existed only as voices in the mountain wind. But it was our own side that truly terrified me. Klaus had stopped bleeding when wounded. A piece of shrapnel that should have killed him passed through his body without leaving a mark. He felt no pain, showed no fear, followed orders with the same automated efficiency as the Italian ghosts. "I still hear them marching," he said during a quiet moment between artillery barrages. "Every night, getting closer." I knew what he meant. The sound of boots on stone, echoing through the mountain passages. Not Italian boots or German boots, the footsteps of soldiers from every war that had ever been fought in these peaks. Romans, Austrians, Napoleonic infantry, medieval mercenaries. All of them still fighting, still dying, still adding their voices to the supernatural cacophony. The haunted village below us burned every night and stood intact every morning. The same impossible cycle we'd witnessed in France, spreading like a virus through every battlefield we touched. War wasn't ending.
It was accumulating. March 1918. Our final offensive became our final nightmare. Operation Michael was supposed to break the stalemate, push through Allied lines, win the war. Instead, it opened doorways that should have remained sealed forever. The massive artillery barrage didn't just shatter enemy defenses, it cracked reality itself. HQ, do you copy? I screamed into the radio as trenches shifted position around us like living things. Grid references are meaningless. The landscape is actively hostile. Static answered, then my own voice from years in the future. The mission ended, but I still hear them marching. Klaus had stopped talking entirely. He followed orders, advanced when commanded, fired when targets appeared. But his eyes had gone empty, reflecting nothing. When I looked closely, I could see the ghost child standing behind his pupils, waving at me from inside his skull. The evil entity had learned to inhabit the living. We weren't fighting the British anymore. We were fighting ourselves. Past versions, future echoes, alternate possibilities where different decisions had been made. I watched myself die a dozen different ways, shot by British rifles, gassed in a surprise attack, blown apart by artillery that materialized from empty air. But each death was temporary. Minutes later, I'd resurrect to die again in a new configuration of horror. The possession was complete now. When I spoke, multiple voices emerged. Weber, Mueller, countless others we'd lost along the way. When I moved, shadow soldiers matched my movements exactly, creating a platoon of the damned, advancing in perfect synchronization. All units, I heard myself broadcast on the radio, though I hadn't keyed the microphone. Welcome to the war that never ends. Take your positions. The next battle begins in 5 minutes. It had been beginning in 5 minutes for over 4 years. I felt invisible hands dragging me deeper into the earth. Not metaphorically, literally. Fingers made of soil and bone and the dreams of dead men pulling me down through trenches that descended far below any foundation we dug. Down into older wars, ancient conflicts, battles fought with bronze weapons and stone axes. Contact all remaining units, I transmitted, though my radio had been destroyed weeks earlier. The enemy is not human. Repeat, supernatural forces confirmed. Klaus stood beside me, or what remained of Klaus. His body had become translucent, filled with the ghostly outlines of every soldier who died in our sector. When he moved, they moved with him, a walking memorial to the war's true casualties. The paranormal encounter had become our entire reality. There was no distinction between combat zone and haunted ground, between military operation and spiritual warfare. We'd been recruited by forces that had nothing to do with nationality or ideology. I thought I was losing my mind, I said to myself, and heard Weber's laughter echoing from underground. You found it instead, came Mueller's reply from inside my own throat. The guilt that followed us home was literal now. A physical presence that walked behind us, casting shadows that belonged to other people, other wars, other times. When we turned around, we saw ourselves as we had been. Young men who believed in victory and honor and the possibility of returning to lives that made sense. But those men were ghosts now. We were the haunted ones, carrying their memories like infected wounds that would never heal.
The extraction point we'd been seeking for 4 years wasn't a location. It was death. And death had been waiting patiently for us to realize we'd already arrived. We'd been fighting for decades inside a single moment. The realization hit when I found my own journal, written in handwriting that had aged 50 years while my hands remained young. Entries describing battles I remembered from yesterday, dated 40 years in the past. Letters home to families who died of old age while I remained frozen in this cursed timeline. "Sir, what's the date?" thoughtful Klaus asked, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. I couldn't answer. The calendar in my head showed 1918, but the world outside our supernatural prison had moved on. Radio transmissions leaked through occasionally. Voices discussing wars we'd never heard of. Weapons that didn't exist. Peace treaties for conflicts that hadn't started when we'd first entered these trenches. The voices in my head belonged to soldiers from every era. Romans fighting Germanic tribes. Napoleonic infantry freezing in Russian snow. Americans dying in jungles that wouldn't be named for generations. All of us trapped in the same temporal anomaly, fighting the same battle across different centuries. Hallucination or reality? I asked the ghost child, who sat perched on Klaus's shoulder like a pale bird. "Time. Sad," she answered, and I understood. We'd become unstuck from linear existence, doomed to experience every possible version of our war simultaneously. Past and future casualties joined our unit, bringing weapons and tactics from conflicts that spanned millennia. The extraction coordinates finally made sense. They weren't spatial, they were temporal. We'd been trying to find our way back to a moment in time, not a place on Earth. But that moment was gone. Had been gone since the first shell exploded. The first man died. The first supernatural force recognized this ground as fertile soil for eternal conflict.
The new recruits arrived this morning, fresh-faced boys in clean uniforms, carrying equipment that gleamed with factory polish. They looked exactly like we had in 1914, eager, confident, ready to serve their country with honor and courage. I wanted to warn them, tried to speak, to explain what they were walking into. But my voice came out as radio static, my words transformed into the same whispers that had haunted us from the beginning. "Welcome to the Special Forces Unit," I heard myself say in Hauptmann Mueller's voice. "You'll be infiltrating enemy territory under cover of darkness." Klaus stood beside me, or behind me, or inside me. Spatial relationships had lost meaning. He nodded approval as I delivered the briefing we'd received so many years ago, or yesterday, or tomorrow. The temporal loop was perfect, inescapable. The ghost child walked among the new soldiers, invisible to their eyes but clearly present to mine. She smiled at each fresh face, already knowing which ones would die first, which would break under the psychological pressure, which would join our eternal patrol through landscapes that existed between heartbeats. This part wasn't in the mission briefing, one of the recruits would say soon. They always did. The script never changed. I still hear them marching, these new voices joining our chorus. Their footsteps echo through trenches that stretch across time and space, connecting every battlefield that ever was or ever will be. The war hadn't ended. It had metastasized. The fog rolled in from the horizon, thick and purposeful. In its depths, I could see the shapes of soldiers from conflicts not yet fought, carrying weapons not yet invented, dying deaths not yet imagined. The mission continued. The mission would always continue. Embarrassment
You've served in places that felt wrong, where the landscape itself seemed hostile, where you heard voices that couldn't be explained. Let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more declassified nightmares from the spaces between wars.